Hi, this is Janet Fitch, and it is noon on Wednesday, so it is Writing Wednesday, where I answer your writing questions, craft questions, um, any kind of questions about the writing life, about writing, about uh, whatever's on your mind. If it's something that is troubling you, it's something that is troubling more than you. So go ahead and ask questions. I'll take questions in the chat. And if you have questions for me during the week, send them to me through my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and I can do a Writing Wednesday around your question. So, welcome. We're towards the end of summer here, and I hope that you've been able to get some work done. If you're on vacation, take notes. And so we have questions from the interwebs. Today we've got several questions, but the one I like the best, which is, of course, the one I think most people have this question, is how do experienced writers decide what parts of their world building and lore should actually appear in the story versus what stays behind the scenes? So this is a question that, hey, Pozena, this is a question that can be thought of as world building, especially people who are working in fantasy, science fiction, uh, creating wholesale, people who are writing in genre in general, but especially imaginary worlds. Hi, Amy. Hi, Sarah. Um, it's how much to include, when you're doing historical, how much to include. Um, and it's an interesting, especially interesting in science fiction, which is world building, soup to nuts mostly. And you do want your reader does want to be immersed in your world and understand um, the nuances of the world you've built. It is a character. I I have, every writer deals with this. When you're writing historical, how much of the history, how much of the culture, how much of the social mores, the lore, as this one was talking about, do you include? All right, so a range of, I have a range of thoughts on this. Um, I think science fiction, especially, but historical as well. People they do want to experience that world. They do want to experience the lore of that culture. However, you only get as much as your story will hold before the reader goes, there's nothing happening here, and away they go. I have certainly had the experience of reading, maybe some people really like this book, but I did not. Um, it was, oh, now it's crossed my mind. It's a book set in Manhattan in the 19th century. Um, is it Lighthouser book, about New York in the maybe the turn of the century? I'll look it up while we talk. And it was like he was licking the scenery. And to my mind, I always think, what would a character in that world, um, uh, what would a character in that world think about? What would they notice and what would they skip? So there's scenery licking, and than larger historical moments that need to be explained. If you're dealing with, say, an historical moment, you know, if you read Wolf Hall, any kind of historical, you're going to need the context, enough context to understand what's going on in the scene. But just because you know how the phones work doesn't mean you have to explain how the phones work. Just because you did the research, or in science fiction, because you can, um, because you have gone to all this work to create that world. I want to remind you that it's the story that is taking place inside that world that we're interested in. So this is a foreground background question. Um, how do experienced writers decide what parts of their world building and lore should actually appear in the story, and what is something that the writer needs to know to move around inside that world? Um, I think that you have to figure out what is there just for you to lick it, you know, and then what is important to the story. You can have them get into their vehicle in 100 years from now. They can get into that vehicle and drive off without too much technical explanation. So putting the vehicle that maybe runs on magnets or whatever it does, um, you can talk about the soft purr of its magnetic engine, but if you get too into the weeds on it, you're going to be licking the scenery. The reader is not going to be able to follow. It will stop your story. So it's a foreground background thing. The story of the story, what's going on with the people, is the foreground. And the all that world building and lore and stuff it's the background, it's the wallpaper, you know. And when you bring it too far forward, you lose the momentum of your story. Hi, Wendy. Hi, GB. Good to see you. um, I'm trying to remember the name of this. Anybody remember the name of this? It's not a doctoro, but it was a very popular novel about Manhattan in I think it was the 19th century. Um, Now I can picture it now. It'll come to me eventually. Manhattan history. Let's see if I can grab it. Yeah, we have this wonderful thing. I mean, good novelists bring it alive, like Doctorow, bring it alive, their place, their world, um, historical or whatever. They bring it forward without losing the sense that this is real, that people don't spend that much time figuring out um, how the telephone worked. The author has to know. This is the question. Experienced writers. The author has to know. You have to know how the phone worked. I have to know how a 1916 even road outboard motor works, or a finger or a knitting machine. Um, I used those in the Russian novels. Um, I had to know how they worked, but I had to cull a lot of it out of the scenes that I was working in, because it just doesn't, one doesn't, if you go to work, you don't sit there and explain how your knitting machine works. You just use it, you knit, you fumble, maybe you miss a pin, and then you have to go back and rip it out again. So then we know it's pins and it's cylindrical, and some basic facts about it. But when you start licking the scenery, you're flipping your foreground and your background. Your story doesn't exist so that you can extol you know some bit of lore. Um, Although a good story, if it's something that your character is thinking about, so how to work in lore, say, um, you have to let it come out of the story. So if you are world building in science fiction or fantasy, where and that's the world building, the heaviest world building of all, um, it has to come out of what the character is going through. So I'm lost in the woods in this fantasy novel. I'm a character lost in the woods, and I come across this strange mushroom. And to explain in a removed voice what that mushroom is and what the lore around it is and the pixie that lives there and blah, 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 whatever it is. Um, you can have the character know it for some reason, but why do they know it? What are they thinking actively in character as they come across it? What is the emotion? It's like, oh no, it's one of those green mushrooms where you know, they're watching me as I go along. I see the glow of the orange spots. That means the blah, blah, blah is in residence. You work it in to how the character feels about it, what's going on, and then um, move on. Um, I think that Frank Herbert in Dune Herbert does a really good job with his all his devices and stuff like that. Not too licky. And I read something recently that was, I believe, now I'm going to click on this. That was sci-fi and was just way too involved in the mechanics of. Uh, I think it was building a program or something like that. Um, and it was just like enough about the K145, uh, we don't need to know that much to believe that the character is a designer or a programmer and knows their stuff, you know. Um, Maybe not 3 paragraphs on that algorithm, you know. How does it relate to their story? Um, so experienced writers try to um, make sure that things are described in a way that the person who is accustomed to that would, how much energy or thought would they give to that? How much do we need to know to understand the story? Um, I think that Gibson is really good with that. William Gibson, who does a lot of futuristic stuff. I mean, he's definitely dealing with games and invented worlds, but he doesn't lick the scenery. You're with that character. You're really interested in what that character is going to do, um, and then what they encounter. Historical, you're always dealing with the problem of how does the character know all this stuff. I, you know, Wolf Hall, the character Cromwell, is very high placed and has spies everywhere, and so he hears a lot of intel. He knows a lot of stuff, but he's never like, well, in Elizabeth and blah, 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 and we did this, and this is how it runs, and this is what it is. It's more, I've got to appear here before the council of six or however many lords there are. And this is the strategy. And so is going to do this, and so is going to do this. And they say that blah, blah, blah did blah, 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 back up in Scotland, and I can hold that over him rather than pulling yourself out and like, look at this scenery, look at this, look at this, look at this, the Jacobin cabinetry of the, no, he walks past an elaborately carved door, um, is fine. You don't have to get into the details of Jacobean furniture, um, even if you know it. Uh, I every writer gets caught in the weeds. Every writer gets caught in the weeds. I hope it's like you want to. What did Chanel say? Is you get dressed and then you take something off. As a writer, go ahead and put it in if you have to, if you want, you're immersed and you want to know, and it's very fresh in your mind. That's research problem right there. It's very fresh in your mind, so you want to, you know, put that right down on the page. Watch out for recently acquired, recently acquired information because you need to have it drip down into the subsoil a little bit before it's kind of ready for the page. It has to be. It's like wine, you got to let it rest for a while before it's ready. Fresh information stands out like a poorly restored painting. The new paint is just because you're too excited about it. So watch your research, let it bubble down. Don't use it right away because you'll be licking that scenery. It's not good. Um, and then a lot of things will, this sounds superstitious. I don't think it's mystical or magical, but I think that if you know things, but you don't put them on the page, the flavor of the um, authority with which you're dealing with the situation, that flavor will come through and affect the book, even if the details of the Jacobean furniture, you're not going to include them. There's something about even a bit of description of passing a door or a chest or something. It'll come through if it's been digested and not just recently, oh my God, I know everything about Jacobean furniture. Oh, so interesting. I got to put this in. I got to put this in. Um, then take something off, you know, be like Chanel. Um, I think that what should appear in the story versus what stays behind the scenes. Sometimes you just need to figure out how the character learned something. Are we going to learn it with them? Like how the you know, triskelion betting system works. Uh, you have to have them in the game or learning the game. And does that help your story or not? The legends and lore have to come through the character. And especially asking yourself if you are using a telephone, say if you're using a cell phone, are you going to talk about the system by which cell phone transmission takes place in 2024, whatever, 2025? How much time are you really going to spend thinking about how that device works? Will this guy, 50 years from now using his device, I don't think is going to be thinking a lot about it either. So you can just, a well-placed adjective, will often take care of it. Um, so it's a dance, sometimes you really want to, have the legend of the well. You want to talk about the legend of the well. You have in Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables, um, there is a cursed, there's a curse on the well in this house. There's a house and it's cursed and the land is cursed and the well was the reason for the curse. So we have to know what happened, that the guy who originally owned the house and had the well was burned or drowned as a witch, accused of a witch, because the people who have got the land and the house accused him so that they could get the land and the house. And he put a curse on that family. Uh, so we do have to know what went on at the well. What do we need to know and what don't we need to know? Um, I think that you want to both make a vivid story, but have the character, what the character would notice, what the character would tell us, rather than just the author talking about everybody's seen that movie where they have the vintage cars and the cinematographer slash director cannot get over the cars and just licking those vintage cars, the vintage this, the vintage that, versus a well done historical where they have the vintage cars and they look amazing. But the people just get out of the car and go into the building and keep on with their lives. So the tendency to linger over those details that you've lovingly created. Um, and world building in science fiction is it's think about how the character sees that, so keep the character front and center and you'll do a lot better with that. So anybody writing science fiction or doing world building, anybody has questions about this? I'm having, I have questions about it in the, not questions, but overloading it in what I'm currently writing. I'm writing about a city I know very well. And somebody said, Janet, it's like going to early on, I mean, I've cut a lot of it, but somebody said, Janet, it's like going back to my boyfriend, to a boyfriend's hometown. And every time we go anywhere, he's showing me, he's pointing out, oh, this is where Johnny, pushed so and so down the hill in the cart, in the shopping cart, and Johnny broke his leg. And everything on that ride will trigger a memory. And just because you know it doesn't mean it belongs in a story. It's like, what's the most important thing? So if the guy has 6 stories that he's going past as he's driving down the street in his little small town with his big city girlfriend, um, he should pick one of those stories, or the writer should pick one of those stories that actually affected this guy and gives her a different sense of him than it had before. Does the world, that piece of lore, tell us more, something we didn't know about the character or about this story that we're reading? Um, there's a wonderful book called Laurus, Laurus, set in medieval Russia by a guy named Volodoskin, um, that he's got to create the world of a 15th century holy fool in Russia in the Middle Ages, in the Russian medieval period, and imbue it with the quality of the character. So it's not just we're seeing snow. We're seeing that snow through somebody's eyes, and then what's under the snow is more interesting than the snow itself. But so you both have to bring the world to life, but it has to be, you're bringing it to life. You're not just panning and scanning, and this is this, and this is looks like this, and but it reminds somebody of something, and it comes out of the plot. It's a, and it, you can have this problem in non-sci-fi, non-historical work, non-fantasy work, where I love a good description, but you have to keep it in check because it can stop the momentum of your scene. You need it, just like you need all the flavors in soup, but you don't, if you put too much garlic in it, you're not going to be able to taste anything else. So which parts of world building and lore should actually appear? Notice when you're just overloading it, go back and take something off. If that drive through your boyfriend's, through the boyfriend's hometown has too many stops, just ask yourself, do I need to know this? Does the reader need to know this? So it's heightening what they actually need to know, like pruning roses. You take off the side buds so that the center flower gets very large. You want to figure out what to highlight and what doesn't need to be highlighted. Otherwise, it gets very clotted in there, and we're not so interested in your world anymore. Well, any questions on this? Anybody doing historical or reading something that had way too much, they'd foregrounded their background? Millhauser, Stephen Millhauser. What the hell was that book? Okay, now I remember it. Stephen Millhauser. And the book was Martin Dressler. Martin Dressler. If you want to see somebody licking the scenery, take a look at that. Also look at Carol, the movie, which had way too much scenery licking. It was really oppressive. It's just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. I'm trying to think of the movie we saw recently that was set historically, but they didn't just sit there and lick the cars. It was cars. Was it a Godfather, maybe? It was something like that. Well, the Godfather does a wonderful job. There's all kinds of old cars in that thing. There's all kinds of detail in that movie. But it stays in the background. It just is. The characters don't marvel at it. They don't go over it. So you do want to be a little nonchalant when you're describing things, and stay in character. So your character will help you out with that. If you say I had to do a bathhouse during the Revolution, there wasn't in Marina M. There wasn't a lot of running water anymore because the city workers, city government was a party that had been attacked by the Bolsheviks. Because they were socialists, but they weren't Bolsheviks, so their power wasn't leading into the Bolshevik camp. The power was still socialist, but it wasn't them. So they had to get rid of these people, the social revolutionaries, who ran civic government, city government, picked up the trash, kept the water on, that kind of stuff. And so nothing was working, and urban people were started using the public baths that poor people used um, for centuries. And how do you describe this without, uh, the public baths were this, were that? Well, you keep them in their character. So my character, who was a very affluent girl who'd never been to a public bath, like what is going to hit her versus what would hit her 3 years later when she always went to those public baths. Maybe she'd notice something different um, than she noticed when she had never been there before. Like how familiar is your character with the world they're being handled? That's why many books, of course, have outsiders as protagonists so that we can see through their eyes and notice things that a habitué would not. Okay, so here's some questions. Okay, GB says, I'm working on a 1970s story about Alaska. Some years ago, an agent at a literary conference wanted me to build more world into the story. Okay, so they're noticing an absence. It's a world we don't know much about, and you cannot assume as much. So this is adding world. So what would your character, if your character is going to a meeting, say, in January in Anchorage, you know, what's that weather? Doing the weather is really important. Being able to do the weather and do the landscape, what the textures of weather, what does it feel like on the body to be that cold, or that, having light, 24 hours of light, um, what's growing, what's going on, enough to paint a picture. And then you have the three levels of landscape where you're the master shot, where the sky is the actor. What's the sky like? Over what? Uh, then personal level is about the size of a room. So if you're outdoors, indoors, you know, if it's Alaska, you're going to want to be outdoors a little bit just to tell us what it's like. Um, and do the three levels. Like, how does it feel on the skin? What's under the hand? Are you picking ice off of your windshield? What's that like? Um, did you almost hit an elk? How big was the elk? Coming across the road. What does it look like? Thank God for YouTube. You can go on and see driving in Anchorage and sit there and look, and what is your character going to encounter? And put us in the body of the character. So I think that's a really good idea. So GB says, are you talking about the White Russians or a different group? You mean Marina M? Um, no, this takes place in Revolutionary St. Petersburg, um, Petrograd, uh, before, during, and after the revolution. So it's the average people, and that there are Bolsheviks, there are formers, um, but the whites are in they flee that central area, and they go to Siberia. They go to the south, the Don. Um, so yeah, check it out. Sarah says, I'm amused by your choice of historical examples, as both old telephones and cars figure prominently in my novel in progress as plot devices. Yeah. So just be really careful, because I have a character, in Marina M, in Chimes of the Lost Cathedral, the second book. Marina works as a telephone operator at the Central Telephone Exchange. So I do have to give you a sense of wear the apparatus, you wear the apparatus and what it's, and then you have to plug the things in the holes, and you hear, people tell you who they're trying to call. So I have to know all that, but the book can only, it's like a horse, you can't put too much on that horse or it's going to break down. How much does the reader need to know to understand the action of the scene? um, yeah, old telephones and cars, and a private phone versus, going to the post office to use that phone. It's interesting. And yeah, so careful. Um, so, hi, Mariam. Good to see you. She says, if I'm writing a story with world building, I always feel the need to explain how things work so the reader isn't left wondering. It's hard to get the balance right. Yeah, yeah. Well, you need to know. So look it up, look at YouTube's, figure out how the devices were used, how things work, so really securely. But all you have to say is, I went to the phone, took off the cradle, you know, rang the operator, um, asked for blah blah blah. You don't have to, you have to find a way to make people understand. Is it a candlestick phone? Is it a on the wall with a separate receiver? Or is it only an earpiece? Once you figure out what phone it is, an adjective, just slightly, rather than focusing on something that's not the central story. Um, let's see. So GB says, it's funny, I in fact do have a bank scene in January. Great ideas you're giving me. Two guys come into a bank armed to make a deal with the bank president. Yeah. So you come in, and how deep is that snow? You know, I mean, you have to get it off, brush it off of you. Or is it just freaking cold and not snowing? Uh, is there somebody on the street clearing snow up to the bank? Um, how how long does it take um, to thaw out, to kind of regain your consciousness when it's cold? Um, GB says, yeah, the horse analogy, enough but not too much in the pack saddle. Yeah, it's a painting, but your character is moving. Everything is moving. You don't have to describe. Um, if they get out of a car, it doesn't have to be, you know, a 32, Plymouth Mercury, whatever, with twin this and exhaust that and it's shiny and good. No, you know, if the guy comes to pick you up for a date and he's driving, a Buick Twin Six or something like that, that's a character observation. She's impressed by that. So you always have to go with the character. And what would the character notice? What wouldn't they notice? What does the reader need to kind of be in the scene, and what they don't? Okay, who else does really good his world building, and who overdoes it? I've been reading a lot of stuff that especially the sci-fi, of people who are more impressed by the gadgets than by their characters, by the story. Um, and that's a matter of taste, right? What I might think is too much attention to the program that's running. The person who's super into the program and not so interested in the people will be sustained by, and be glad that the writer knows that much. But you have to watch out for what I call face and carpet. It's a little bit too granular, rather than putting the say the bank robbery is first. And then what they know about security, or where the Pinkertons are, or where, if it's I have a protest, more than one protest in the revolution of Marina M, as you can imagine, massive demonstrations, and brutal. I use wall newspapers. People didn't have newspapers, like buying a newspaper. They gathered around a newspaper that was on the wall, and they're not quite unbiased. They were put up by the Bolsheviks. So people would read them, and then you'd have the crowd opining, what do you think is really going on? And I think this, and I think that. And, somebody shows their cap has a metal plate, so that if they get hit on the head by czarist police, it protects the head. And she's like, oh my God, people are getting really serious here. Like, she hadn't really realized how serious it was getting until that guy had that plate in his cap. GB says Tolkien seems to have had the world building down enough, but not too much. And he did a complete world. But, sometimes one sentence is good, but a whole paragraph is too much. That's where you start licking the scenery. You need to know what's happening. You need to know what that device, or that, how that door worked, but you don't need a paragraph about it. What about Moby Dick? There's a perfect example. Moby Dick, it's a world we don't know anything about, whaling. I didn't know anything about it, and I think a lot of people reading Moby Dick had no idea about it. The detail is part of the character, the texture of that life. There is a chapter that's just whaling paraphernalia, and many people skip it. But it's such a great, the language is so amazing, very biblical, that I heard it on audio. And it was the only time I was actually able to get through Moby Dick, was listening to it, because the language is just so exquisite. And I found I was actually interested in all the, the parts, the objects used in whaling. So it's a very tactile kind of thing. It was done well. I'm sure that today, very few publishers would allow that much description of objects as Moby Dick. I don't think that would be a book. I think that would be a book that would have a very hard time finding publication in our time. But very vivid. I'm trying to think of people who just overdo it, though, where I've put it, well, they don't come to mind so much, because I've put them down and not picked them up again. It's like, I don't need to know that much about that. It's always connected to the character and how they would see it, and historical especially. It's like, if I don't want to know how many layers of skirts and hoops and corsets and stuff like that, then I would become impatient with a lot of romance, but sometimes, if you can keep it in character of somebody who is just overwhelmed by all this crap, somebody who's unfamiliar with the corsetry and stuff, and then all this stuff that's going on, and it just becomes more and more uncomfortable. until, you're absolutely rigid at the end of it. Or you can also have a character who is getting ready for a seduction. And putting on all that stuff is like a knight putting on armor. It can be very sexy. So you have to figure out your character and then how you're going to use that stuff. It's not without an emotional spin. So Sarah says, do you think that Moby Dick not being publishable now is more about reading tastes or about publishing, both? I think that people are people like a smaller book now. So publishers like a smaller book now. So publishers like a smaller book now. So that's what they're feeding the reading audience. So I think it's a I don't say it's a symbiotic relationship, but I think it's a spiral, and one affecting the other, Laura said, I thought lessons in chemistry was good about not talking about chemistry much. Yeah, a really good example. Primo Levi's The Periodic Tables is about chemistry, but of course it's not about chemistry. It's about being a prisoner in a Nazi work camp, and then working as a chemist, and stories about that. Um, yeah, we tend to remember the ones that worked well, but the ones that didn't work well, it's like, if I have to hear one more thing about um, X, I'm going to kill myself. And then you close it up. And then you don't even remember that there was too much of that going on. I think people um, especially have to think about it when they're doing world building, where nothing can be assumed in a science fiction novel or in a fantasy novel. And then how much do you need to do, and how much is the author just playing? Just put it not graphically. How much is the author just playing with themselves? I mean, it's fun to invent, but it's for a purpose. And the purpose has to be the major thing. Yeah, so Dune, I think, did a really good job with it. All right, well, thank you very much for coming to Writing Wednesday, and please feel free to send me any questions you have through my website. I'm happy to hear from you, janetfitchwrites.com, and wishing you good world building, and we'll see you next time. Okay.